I should say I believe mindfulness's growing popularity in the mainstream is of a direct response to the attention economy. And I believe that mindfulness is a personal form of attention activism which resists the economy.
Hello and welcome to Digital Mindfulness. I'm your host, Lawrence Sampofo. Today we're here with the award-winning experienced designer and researcher, Jay Vidyarthi. Jay focuses on human-centered approaches to creating products, services, and systems, and he was recently named by Forbes as one of the top 10 meditation tech experts. His work was used on his former role at Muse, the brain-sensing headband, and also in his academic work on persuasive technologies for mindfulness. Jay is also one of the creators of A Mindful Society, a Toronto-based conference which attracts people from education, government, healthcare, business, and more. You should listen to this episode if you want to find out about the impacts of the attention economy, how to create more meaningful content by linking it with your values, and why mindfulness is the perfect antidote to a digitally distracted world. But first of all, welcome to the show. For 3 years, we've brought you the best teachers and thought leaders to teach you how to be your best self in a digitally distracted world. If you're new to our show, then the best place to find out much more about us is to visit digitalmindfulness.net/start, which has a collection of some required listening podcasts where we discuss everything from becoming more focused to habit building, cyberbullying, and much, much more. So enjoy the show with Jay Vidyarthi. Hi Jay, thanks so much for being a part of the show, and I'm really thrilled to have you on and to be able to talk about your amazing work. So welcome.
Oh, thanks for having me. I'm just humbled to be here. I saw some of the guests you've previously had on, and it's just some amazing people. So I'm just humbled to be a part of it.
So Jay, can you give us a little bit of a background to yourself and your journey, and particularly how you came to be focusing on this amazing area of mindful, persuasive design?
So I go into McGill University in Montreal to study physics, and then I realized that, I look to my left and I look to my right, and I realized that I am not a physicist. I actually dropped out of school to play music for a while and got really interested in sound. And then I came back after, playing with some bands and starting my own recording studio. I came back to school to study psychology and neuroscience, sort of in response to realizing, I think a little bit, that moment where I realized I was actually in control of my own life. Which is something I think we lose in the modern school system a little bit. So, I was like, I can actually choose what I want to do. And I was already very passionate about psychology and mental health. So I finished my undergraduate degree in psychology and neuroscience. And just at the tail end, discovered a passion for how that stuff applies to design. At which point I worked in industry in UX. At the time, the field was very young, so I spent most of my time convincing people that UX was a thing. And so I worked on that for a while, sort of built up my skills with this amazing consultancy in Montreal, and then had my second sort of moment where I was like, some of these projects that I'm working on are a lot more important than others. Why is that? Why am I feeling personally motivated by the work I'm doing for the United Nations and the Canadian Institute of Health? And why am I feeling exhausted and frustrated for this project for a startup and this insurance company? So this awakening was really about the interaction between values, personal values, and design. When you're a designer, you manifest values into the world. And if you don't realize that, then you're inadvertently doing it. And so I totally awakened to that reality, decided to go to graduate school to explore whether I could design something that was tied to my personal values, which at the time I was very devoted to the cause of mental health. I was still interested in music and sound. So I went to graduate school and I started researching the intersection between technology, design, mindfulness, and sound, and created a project called Sonic Cradle, which was an attempt to create technology that would introduce non-practitioners to mindfulness experientially. That was really a passion project. It went a lot better than I expected it, which was a blessing. At first, I was frustrated by the lack of support, and 2 years later, I was humbled by the incredible wide-ranging support. So, a beautiful testament to how amazing people can be to support your work. And that led me to industry, where I actually declined to continue in academia because some of the personal and systemic issues I was having with the way academic research works. And I went completely the opposite to join a startup called Interaxon, which had an early prototype of a consumer brain sensor. And the founders there were starting to think about how this might be applicable to mindfulness. And so when we connected, it was just very clear. I remember very clearly coming into the room to meet Trevor, and an early phone conversation with Ariel and Chris, who were the three founders of the company. And it was just an obvious match. They had this crazy, awesome, cool technology, low cost EEG, democratizing some incredible scientific tools. And I was publishing on how to design for the experience of mindfulness. So we worked together, and a year and a half later, released our first version of Muse, the brain sensing headband, where I defined and led the design process, where I was really concerned with how to turn this technology into an accessible tool for non-practitioners who maybe were a little bit not well adapted to the group session and maybe the guided meditation approach and the new agey sense of mindfulness, to see whether we could create a new door to that same room. And so that product was a success, and it was an exciting time to actually connect with so many people who might otherwise never find mindfulness, and introduce them to this world, welcome them to this world of mindfulness as a secular, cognitive, perceptual, and emotional practice. And now I'm the design thinking chair for A Mindful Society, which is a community event focused on understanding systems, how mindfulness plays a role in our education system, our healthcare system, in public organizations, in private organizations, in government, in law, and in daily life. We attract people who are doing this work across various sectors to share best practices. And I'm getting really passionate about how mindfulness applies to the public sector and government more specifically, where I'm just on the cusp of starting a new project in that domain, which I can't say a lot about. So there you go. There's the story in 5 minutes.
That is a really compelling story, and I particularly like the bit at the beginning when you were mentioning how you had to convince people that UX was actually a thing.
Yeah, that was fun. I was like, I was standing on the shoulders of giants in the field for sure. So not to say that I was like the flag bearer of that, but it was funny, the difference between going in to a technology company and trying to convince them that usability is relevant to their business, to 10 years later, where everyone is talking about UX. It's just been incredible to see that happen.
So Jay, I wonder if you can tell us a little bit more about Sonic Cradle and what that is exactly. Just doing my reading about that online, it seems that you were one of the very first people to be thinking about bringing together technology and mindfulness. But I wonder if you can just explain a little bit more why it was so important and what exactly it is.
So Sonic Cradle is almost like a sensory deprivation chamber, except without the water. Your body is suspended on a hammock in complete absolute darkness, and you're surrounded in speakers, which you can't see. And basically what you do is you control a soundscape using only your respiration. Now, it sounds really high-techy and weird, and it can be easily misconstrued as some kind of cool art project. And actually, that's one of my major criticisms of a lot of the mindfulness technology that is being explored in the academic context, is a lot of it is just like, oh, wouldn't it be cool if, which is sort of I think a misappreciation of the depth through which one can design. So the design process of Sonic Cradle was actually a meticulous literature review of the research on mindfulness, not only of the benefits, which a lot of people are talking about now because people are particularly interested in marketing mindfulness. So being able to say that it reduces stress is valuable, both marketing as a consumer product, but also like convincing an organization to take it up. But I was also interested in what the neuroscientists and the anthropologists were saying in terms of operationalizing mindfulness practice, operationalizing it. So basically, the anatomy of most focused attention mindfulness practices were described in the literature as you try to pay attention to something, often your breath or maybe a visualization. Eventually, your mind wanders and you get distracted. And then at some point, you notice that you've been distracted and you bring your attention back to whatever it was you were supposed to focus on, and often with a certain intention, a certain attitude of non-judgment. So when I think about what it means to start a mindfulness practice as a design problem, I see that new practitioners often deal with a couple of things. One is not knowing if they're doing it right. And two, and I think a very strong feeling that people get is a feeling of failure or a feeling of, oh, mindfulness isn't for me, or I'm no good at this. And it's not surprising. I mean, you're being told to pay attention to your breath, and the typical person is pretty sure they're in control of their own mind. So it doesn't seem like it should be that hard. And then you sit down and you're like, okay, take a breath. And then 5 seconds later, you're like, what's for dinner? And then like, oh, wait, breath. And then 10 seconds later, you're like, what am I even doing here? That person is wearing a weird shirt and blah, 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 whatever. And then, people always tell this story about mindfulness, but what they forget is that the beginner in about a minute is like, this is really annoying. This is really hard. I suck at this. I'm terrible at this. Mindfulness is not for me. And this is really the root cause of why when you talk to people, they're like, oh, I don't know if I could do that. I couldn't sit still. Because every time they've tried, it's just felt like a horrible failure. And so what Sonic Cradle was an attempt to do was to create sort of training wheels, or in the language of human-computer interaction, a persuasive technology to experientially introduce you to mindfulness. And so you're sitting here in this sound chamber, and you're instructed that your breathing controls sound. So you take a breath and you hear some sound come in. And then you take another breath and you hear a different sound come in, and the sound is being modulated in real time. And so you have this kind of playful, curious thing. You weren't told that this was meditation. You weren't told you were supposed to focus on anything. You're just playing the same way if you play a video game, the first thing you do is figure out what button does what, right? So you're playing around with your breath and you're paying attention to your breath. But of course, I've left you in there for 15 minutes and it's not that fun. So like 2 minutes in, you're like, oh, what's for dinner? What is that person saying? Or is this thing going to be over soon? And you're getting lost in thought. But instead of judging yourself, because your respiration is deeply linked to your attention, and it kind of straddles the fence between voluntary and involuntary, that is to say you can control your breath, but it also continues involuntarily if you don't control it, the sound naturally starts to change as your mind wanders, which draws your attention back to your breath because you're like, what's for dinner? And then the sound goes, whoa, because your breathing has changed. And so you naturally go back to your breath, but not in a sense of self-judgment and, oh, I'm terrible at this. You were never told you were supposed to focus on anything in the first place. Instead, you come at it with a playful curiosity. And so after 15 minutes, the research question was what the subjective experience would be like. And so we did an intersubjective 3-rater validity qualitative analysis of, if I remember correctly, like 30 or 40 people in the system, and there was some really strong trends about clarity of intention, loss of intention, clarity of mind, and some other sort of mental states and phenomena that seemed to be indicative of mindfulness. So Sonic Cradle was kind of like an attempt to design a more advanced experience of mindfulness around the problem of the feeling of failure and judgment, to give people an experiential introduction of where they're trying to get and why this practice has value.
I think you're definitely right that a lot of the mindfulness tools at the moment on the market have been marketed as kind of productivity or creativity unblockers, as it were. But Sonic Cradle seems to me to have a lot of therapeutic benefits.
I would say that that's possibly the case, and that the data certainly suggests that. But it's difficult to make that claim without very specific data. But I will contrast because, being the lead designer for Muse, which was a consumer meditation product that's reasonably successful, that there's like big contrasts between those two projects, and they very much have to do with the systems in which those projects were created. And I think this is sort of betraying a little bit why I mentioned that I'm moving to the systems level, because I see the deep connection here. So I think Sonic Cradle is limited in its impact and its realization of the therapeutic potential, which I personally do believe is there, because of the way the academic system works, in the sense of who's going to get to use it and whether it's ethical to put it out there, right? Versus the consumer product, which has an advantage in that, in the sense that we were able to design and create it in a year and release it and have it be out there. But then, of course, the difficulty in a capitalist economy is the way that Muse has to be designed and marketed in order to sustain a startup and build a profitable business. So, it's not really answering your question about the therapeutical potential, but kind of injecting my own interest here is that, I think all of this stuff has therapeutic potential because it connects to mindfulness, which I firmly believe has therapeutic potential, and a lot of science is pointing to that. But the actual manifestation of the things we create are deeply related to the systems we create them in.
I absolutely think you're right, Jay, and I think, moreover, I've spoken a lot to the guests about this when they come onto the show, and how the technology that we create, that a lot of people are kind of waking up to the fact that actually this technology isn't good for us. It's the product of the economic system in which it's created. And so at the moment, we're becoming more and more aware of the fact that technology and apps, a lot of them are very, very sticky. They try to grab and manipulate our time, and more importantly, our attention. But of course, that is what designers, engineers, and companies, this is what they're rewarded by economically. So it's kind of a bind to get out of that wheel, if you like.
Yeah, I think you're referring to the attention economy, which is a growing topic, and I think it's extremely important. I think there's some great work being done. Tristan Harris and Tim Wu's Attention Merchants is a fantastic book about the history of this. But to tie it back to my own projects, Sonic Cradle is, as it stands, is not a viable business concept, because its goal is to introduce you to a practice that you can do on your own and then render itself obsolete, right? And you compare that to Muse, where once we had it up and running and people were engaging with it, the goal quickly became retention. How do we keep people engaged with this product? How do we, have long-term use so maybe we could explore deeper engagement with our users? And, it would be extremely controversial. I mean, it was extremely controversial when I would bring up the issue that I think the goal of Muse is for people to not need it, right? And it's, of course, controversial in the context of a capitalist business for the right reasons, because I'm not anti-capitalist. I believe that Muse is an organization that's trying to do an amazing thing for the world, and that we need it to grow. So those tensions are real, and they very much define the kind of work we did. And I'm extremely proud of the impact that Muse has had on people's lives. One thing that would always motivate me is reading the product reviews on Amazon or the App Store, where a lot of the design projects in my past, a 5-star review is like, wow, that was phenomenal. It was so easy to find the thing I was looking for. Whereas a 5-star review of Muse is like, I'm a better mother, or my insomnia is gone. And that's just an incredible and humbling effect to have on people. But to anyone out there who's thinking about getting involved in mindfulness and technology, just actually getting involved in any project, especially as a designer, a creative, an engineer, or even as a business person, a strategic leader, it's very important to think about what the institution within which you are creating that is, and what its incentives are, because they're very much going to define the trajectory of that project. And I think that very much is what Tristan Harris is talking about and what Tim Wu are talking about when it comes to the attention economy, where if you look at the incentives of Facebook and Google and Twitter, it's a very strong tension there. I do believe a lot of people, those companies are trying to do the best for people, and those technologies have brought an incredible amount of value to our life. But since the incentive is financial, the financial incentive is tied to the advertising industry, and the currency of the advertising industry is attention. We have technology addiction, we have fake news, we have incredibly addictive smartphones, we have like freemium models like Candy Crush, like emptying people's bank accounts, and all these difficult situations that we have to deal with. So, I don't have an easy solution, but I think, understanding the incentives of the institution and the people and the money and where the money's coming from are absolutely pivotal in understanding where your creations are going to go.
Everything we're speaking about here really reminds me of the Stanford Prison Experiment, and particularly that the environment that you're in shapes not only your personality or your behavior, but also what you project into the world. And this is something that one of our previous guests, Irene Al, this is what she spoke about with regards to design, that what we design is really a reflection of ourselves, both individually and as a society. And I'm wondering, if you were speaking to a new generation of designers, what would you recommend then they do to overcome the limitations that we're speaking about, to transcend that economic system and to really design something that is useful and impactful in a positive way to humanity?
It's really about values to me. I think it's not only irresponsible, but also unfair to create things in an environment that do not align with your values. Like I said earlier, if that's what you're doing, then you're inadvertently creating something that doesn't align with your values. So I would say that my direction forward is that if we have the agency and the power, and we're fortunate enough to be in a world where we are controlling what we contribute to, which isn't everyone, but if we are in that world, then it is our moral responsibility to be thoughtful and intentional about what we do. And like I said, all of these different sectors, like I've worked in healthcare, I've worked in startups, I've worked in large organizations, I've worked in, pseudo-private public organizations, I've worked in public organizations. They all have their pros and cons. So there's this balancing act between aligning your values and your creation with an environment where you can make the difference you're hoping to see. And I think the counter example, or I guess the anti-pattern here, is if you're not intentionally aligning your values with what you're creating, and you are in a position where you could be, I think you are shirking an important responsibility of being someone who's so fortunate to be in a situation where they could have choice and they're not taking it.
So I really want to go back to mindfulness, and particularly something you said at the beginning of the interview, that the way that we approach building technologies to promote people building a mindfulness practice is that we approach it by thinking like, wow, wouldn't it be cool if we built this, or if we built that feature or that feature? And I wonder whether you think, again, thinking about this whole idea of values, whether you think mindfulness now or mindful technologies are having that good effect on the world, if they are being linked up with our values, or whether something else is happening.
I mean, I think that problem you mentioned, wouldn't it be cool, kind of sort of is endemic to engineering and the way we teach engineering. So I think you find that a lot in people in engineering who are just kind of building what could be cool, right? Like Uber for this, Uber for that, machine learning for this, machine learning for that, without any sort of sense, again, of what I was talking about earlier, about what the intention of that project is and their impact on the world. So the way mindfulness plays a role in this, I think, is twofold. One is personally, I think the only way we can really be in touch with our intentions and our values is to be in touch with ourselves, and some would say our lack thereof. But, I think mindfulness is an incredible practice. And I kind of group mindfulness and compassion together. And I think one of the things that's happening is they're starting to be separate. I know a lot of Buddhist scholars are like concerned that mindfulness is being abstracted from its ancestral roots. I'm not so concerned about that. I do believe we should respect its ancestral roots, but I also believe those ancestral roots come from almost every tradition, that whether it's Kabbalah and Judaism or Gnostic Christianity or Benedictine monks or Sufism or whatever it is, you find contemplative, practitioners in every major human cultural tradition. There's always been that group of people who've decided to explore their conscious experience. So, but what I'm more concerned about is the abstraction of mindfulness from the larger context of compassion, within which it's almost always accompanied in historical traditions, right? So when it was a part of ancient religions or even modern religions, it's always about cultivating your awareness of the present moment to help you understand that not everything is about you. And so there's a bit of a concern I have with the interaction of psychology and capitalism with mindfulness, where it's all about you again, that you're selling these mindfulness tools to become more productive and less stressed so you can be a better person and you can be more successful and you can get the bleeding edge on the golf course or whatever it is. It's a little bit concerning, because what I believe in both my personal practice and what I believe the role that mindfulness and compassion have to play in our systems and our structures is to teach us to work together in a less selfish way. And that really gets to the core of it. If we can learn how to respectfully disagree with each other, if we can learn how to work together in an unselfish way, even in the face of large potential rewards, whether it be fame and money, if we can do that, we can dramatically change all the systems that I've been a part of, and most likely the systems that I haven't been a part of. So I've worked in healthcare, I've worked in private sector, public sector, in academia, and I imagine education is like this, though I don't have a lot of direct experience there, that like these conflicts arise. I mean, we even have geopolitical conflicts, international conflicts, like we don't seem to be able to disagree with each other while still respecting each other. And this is the deep role that mindfulness and compassion can play. So when I get concerned about the modern mindfulness movement, I'm thrilled that mindfulness is hitting the mainstream. The concern is it's usually pitched in selfish ways, because it's pitched in kind of the happiness industry, right? I don't know if you've read that book by William Davies, but it's a phenomenal exploration of how modern psychology and advertising and technology are all tied together into making this concept of happiness an industrial capitalist element, which may not actually be relevant to our deeper happiness.
So one of the things you mentioned at the top of the interview, Jay, was this whole idea that with Muse and with other technologies you've been working with, that the whole idea was to help people, to kind of onboard people onto these practices, these mindfulness practices, and that they would eventually need the tools less. And I'm wondering whether you think this is the ultimate goal for all technologies, whether you think technology's role ultimately is to disappear as they kind of help us develop new behaviors, and then eventually we need them less and less and less.
That's a very interesting question. Okay, I'll take a stab at it, but It's a big one. I guess, with all caveats and qualifiers required, I guess my view on this question is that technology inherently doesn't have a role, right? It's our roles and our intentions. And when we ask questions about the technologies we create and what their role is, we're using different language, but we're actually asking what the intention of the person who created that technology was. And so when you ask me, is technology's role to make itself obsolete? I mean, that's a very broad question. I think we have to tackle that independently for the different types of technologies that we use. So it's difficult for me to abstract the fact that I believe that technologies for mindfulness and compassion, certain technologies for mindfulness and compassion might have the role or the intention of teaching a skill and making themselves obsolete, whereas other technologies for mindfulness and compassion might have a role or a goal of being a support structure for the rest of your life. And then you can broaden that to technology in a wider scope as applied to the rest of our lives and our smartphones and our social networks and whatever. So it's kind of a non-answer, but I think the real nugget I'm providing here is that I don't think technology inherently has a role. I think it's the people who create them that have a role. And if we're asking that question, we should rephrase it to be, what is the role of this specific technology that I'm creating? And what is my intention in creating it? And do those match? Does my intention to create this technology match what I believe its role in society should be?
So I know that for a lot of people in the audience, it's their jobs to go out and create things, whether they're videos or content on social media, or even even something as mundane as writing emails, but we're always creating something every single day. So would that be then your advice to people before they start even thinking about creating something, to kind of sit and be still for a moment and then get in touch with the values that you were talking about, and then that will help them then to create more meaningful content?
I'm gonna say yes and no. I think these are the danger in the way you've pitched it as asking yourself these questions is that it's a very rational approach. So I think that that's definitely a useful tool, is that self-introspection. And I think that, there are other tools to understand your own values in the sort of family of contemplative practices and mindfulness practices. Certainly the Zen tradition has a deep history of asking deep questions and sort of breaking out of the rational mind through that process. But, the questions that I'm talking about as a designer are hyper-rational. So I'd say yes, as long as it's balanced with more personal, intimate and felt senses of getting to know oneself.
So I'm going to ask you something, Jay, that I ask all my guests, and that is, in this age where we're hyper-connected but also digitally distracted, what would you say are the most important human traits, and how do we cultivate those?
Okay, so at the risk of sounding like a broken record, mindfulness and compassion are fundamentally important human traits. And I think they're directly reflected in our world. And I think the attention economy is demanding our attention. I think there are societal, maybe even ethical, maybe even regulatory approaches to managing the attention economy, but I also think the individual freedom is at risk if we go too far down that road. But that I also believe that individual responsibility plays a big role. And I think mindfulness is growing. I believe mindfulness is growing popularity in the mainstream is of a direct response to the attention economy. And I believe that mindfulness is a personal form of attention activism which resists the economy. So to put that in an example, every social media marketer, every marketer and advertiser in general, including all the major tech platforms like Google and Twitter and Facebook, who are selling your attention to advertisers, all of them are competing in a vicious battleground for your attention. And so when you practice mindfulness in today's age, it's not just about health and well-being or finding yourself. There's also an element of standing up to political forces that are taking a commodity from you and profiting it, when really that commodity belongs to you. So I believe you are taking an activist stance on a personal level when you practice mindfulness and reclaim your personal ability to pay attention to what you believe is relevant to you in a deeper level. And then the second trait is compassion, which is, as I said before, I think compassion is relevant for a lot of reasons: for love, for relationships, for family, for interconnectedness, for dissolving in-group, out-group bias, for finding a interconnectedness that allows our overpopulated planet to actually thrive, let alone survive. And I think, again, compassion is going to be even more relevant in the decades to come as we try to rectify things like climate change and geopolitical crises and try to band together given the current political climate of nationalism. Hariri recently wrote a little bit about how the nationalist identity might be failing us in our global scale. And I believe that compassion is going to be the bridge to create the global village that Marshall McLuhan theorized about so long ago. So I do believe it's mindfulness and compassion, but I gave you all that detail to make it clear that it's not in some kind of wishy-washy new age state. It's from a very informed economic, geopolitical, and globalized perspective.
So I think you're definitely right, Jay. I think this whole idea that mindfulness is a direct reaction to the attention economy is really compelling. Definitely so, given that we're so much more aware of our attention, with the whole rise of smartphones and now that computing is with us always. But I'm wondering whether you think that people are even aware of the real value of their attention.
We're not taught. We're not taught the value of our attention. We're not taught emotional intelligence. It kind of blows my mind that we are these fantastically incredible, intelligent monkeys and creatures with this strange conscious experience. And there's so much mystery. And yet every single, human that is born is put through a mandatory 20-year boot camp. I guess if they're lucky, right? They're in the first world and they're able to do that. And this boot camp gives us an incredible amount of value and skill to operate in this world. But in some sense, it's missing such huge things, right? We don't really teach people about mental health and about emotional well-being and compassion and mindfulness. And we don't even teach them how to do their taxes, right? Like every 16-year-old knows what the mitochondria is and that it's the powerhouse of the cell. And they have no idea about, what's going on with the geopolitical situation or how to handle an emotional disturbance in their conscious experience. So I would say yes, but it's not their fault. I'm very compassionate and my fault too. I also suffer from this, and it's not our fault. It's all of our tasks together to find a way to bring mindfulness and compassion into every sector of society. And that goes back to the incredible community we're cultivating here in Toronto at A Mindful Society, where we're trying to create a platform for people who are working in different sectors of society to come together and understand and share and find the best approaches to bring to mindfulness and compassion to every sector of society. And so it's been amazing to have those events and sit side by side with people who are doing this incredible work in public schools, in high schools, in universities, in private companies and organizations, in government, whether legislative or administrative or bureaucratic, people who are doing it in healthcare, either as care practitioners or hospital administrators. There are incredible people doing this work, and they don't even know each other exist. But the movement is growing to actually integrate this into our societal systems, and that change comes from within. And so I think my foray into these technologies has taught me that the concept of a system is not just about how the hardware connects to the software via Bluetooth and how that connects to the user, which is already groundbreaking for the tech community. It's how that is embedded into a sociocultural hegemony and how that is embedded into our political system, and it's all deeply connected. And I think if the mindfulness and compassion movements are going to have the impact they need to be, whether you're working on a startup or tinkering in your basement or in an academic lab or whatever, you need to be thinking about how your creations and your work is impacting the larger sociocultural and political context, because only then can we work together to make this happen. And this really much, I think you're really getting a sense of why I'm starting to think more on the systems level as opposed to moving on to a new technology project, because I really deeply think that there's an opportunity for the mindfulness and compassion movements to change the world, but only if we can connect all these dots together.
So that seems like the perfect place to end. Jay, where can people find out more about you and your work and connect with you?
Yeah, sure. All my projects are listed at myname.com, jayvidyarthi.com. A Mindful Society is amindfulsociety.org. We've had 4 events so far, 3 major events in Toronto, and our next one is, I think, next April or next May. It's a really incredible gathering of people. From an international perspective, we attract world-leading speakers. We've had Chris Ruan, who is the person who led the Mindful Nation UK report in UK Parliament. We've had Judson Brewer, incredible neuroscience leader in the US. We've had Thupten Jinpa, who's the principal translator of the Dalai Lama. And these speakers are incredible, but also one of the most humbling parts of it has been all the amazing people in the audience who are doing this work in various sectors of society. And we've taken a really unique human-centered design and design thinking approach to plan the conferences. So when you come, you don't just listen to speakers, you engage in interactive ideation sessions where we're trying to actually build the Mindful Society organization in the shape of this cross-functional group of people's perceived need of how we can better support champions to bring mindfulness into organizations. So if you're someone who's in any context of any organization or community, and you're trying to figure out how to bring mindfulness into that community, or you're already doing it and you want to learn from other experts who are doing the same work as you, it's a great event. It's a great event to come and attend, because we would love to have you. And it's just been an absolute pleasure to connect with that community.
Well, Jay, thanks so much for being a part of Digital Mindfulness today. I've learned a tremendous amount, and I'm sure everybody else has. So again, thank you for being a part of the show.
I hope so. I think I learned a whole bunch too. So it's been a pleasure. I love doing stuff like this. I love connecting online. So just look me up. More questions, anything like that. I'm happy to connect. As you can tell, I'm pretty passionate about this topic. So.